I am the Lord of Heckfire. They made me censor it for television.
Hello, welcome to Streaming to the Stars. I'm Roland Zada.
And I'm Candice Simbelman.
And today we'll be talking about the Next Generation episode, Measure of a Man.
Yeah, we'll be doing a lot of examining Star Trek especially, because we were both Star Trek fans, but we don't want to just stick to only Star Trek moving forward.
No, we'll be going into different sci-fi movies, anime, whatever, you name it. But for today, we're focusing on Spotlight episodes, so that would be The Measure of a Man and everything that delved into it. And there are a lot of issues in Measure of a Man, such as the concept of rights, the concept of sentience, and the concept of being.
Well, there's several themes in here. So I have in my notes, I have sentience, slavery, bias, and then forced experimentations like mad science type stuff. So it kind of bleeds into things like Mengele from the Nazis, like the mad scientist Nazi. So.
Right. Let's go into the experimentation first, because that's the beginning of the episode and what frames it.
So, well, actually, the beginning starts out with poker. We could talk about that later, because it seems there's actually maybe even a meta reason as to why that's in the episode. Because when we first start out with a poker game, and it only gets referenced in a conversation with Maddox. And Maddox he's the problem. He is the problem that needs to be solved, and it starts all the issues. Okay.
Well, let's introduce Commander Maddox for the benefit of people who don't remember the episode. He's a cyberneticist who's been fascinated by android commanded data on the Enterprise ever since he became aware of his existence, and he wants to create more androids who are exactly like Data. And he proposes a project to Data, Captain Picard, and Commander Riker, and then they start asking questions. Have you figured this out? Have you figured that out? Because they want to use Data's brain as the basis for creating more of these androids. And then Commander Maddox says, no, we haven't quite worked all these issues out, but I want to go forward anyway because, risk versus reward. But if it goes wrong, then you lose Data and you don't gain any extra androids. So Data decides, no, I don't want to go forward with this, and Picard agrees, this sounds dangerous because we might lose Data. And then Commander Maddox is like, well, too bad, I want to do this anyway, and then it becomes a battle of egos.
Yeah, so it's ironic that they put the poker game first, because Maddox actually had it like a chess game, because he wanted to go into it saying that he wanted it under this certain guise, when he had actually already beforehand done several moves ahead, because he was already anticipating the pushback, because he knew he was the only way to get to do this, because it was like this mad scientist obsession, was that he had to almost like dehumanize Data, even though Data is an android, so we had to depersonify or demean him.
Right.
You had to stop him from being a person and remove his personhood and reduce him to a piece of property. And then we get into, there's another character who's also introduced, which is another one of those key characters of Captain Philippa, was it Louvois?
Lavoie. Apologies if we mispronounced that name.
I can't speak French. So she comes in, and she's clearly got the hots for Jean-Luc. And they have this weird tension between them. But then he actually is pompous to her, though, because she calls him out on that. But she still plays along. And I feel like when Maddox comes along, she uses that opportunity to kind of get closer to Picard, because by the end, it does seem like she had actually already determined that she didn't believe Data was property, but she played that game like poker just so she could date Picard at the end, because she was hitting on him. She was constantly trying to set up a situation so that he would be interested in her, but then she knew that tension, it was like she wanted reasons to interact with him. Am I right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the game was a meta for everything that went on later on, because if they didn't challenge Maddox's, well, let me backtrack a bit. First of all, when Commander Maddox assigns Data to him for experimentation, Then Picard immediately objects and wants to challenge that order. And then the Captain Lavoie, she could always say no and refuse the transfer, but instead they decide to go through the process of actually having a trial. And if she just believed that Data was property, she wouldn't have to go forward with the trial at all, but she went through the motions of the trial. And then that's when it went into what you said about how I want to see them go through the process to prove Data's personhood.
To prove that he's a person. And she also played everyone. It's kind of like poker shouldn't be the only theme here. Sometimes it's like chess or checkers. I think it's more chess than checkers. And she made Riker do all these things. And then when they go through the trial, and the trial is actually made to be like digestible so that the audience gets it. And it's very dramatic and theatrical. But it's very abrupt for a trial. It's very quick. You know what I mean? And she forced everyone to go through it. Like, she forced Riker to be the counter argument. What do you call that? Prosecutor or whatever.
That would be the prosecutor.
Yeah, the prosecutor. And the whole situation was actually very stressful and traumatic to everybody because it affected Geordi very hard.
Yeah, he was going to lose his friend.
Yeah, his friend. He had a lot of relationships entangled in this. And I think that this episode addressed these specific themes. It also addressed things like bias. So in the show, you're more likely to, because we know the characters, of course we're going to side with Data because it's very obvious to us that Data is definitely a person. It's there. It's since the first episode, correct? And
yeah,
then the
that's
pilot.
Right.
And then, but the thing is, Maddox, because of his bias, he won't even accept anything else. It's only his objective. So he will accuse everyone else of being emotional and basing their stuff based on emotion, but he's also driven by emotion because he's emotionally invested in himself being this super cyberneticist or this amazing scientist, and it's like this mad scientist kind of trope in there, but he's still trying to pretend like he's not, like I'm just doing the right thing, and I'm just you're stopping progress or something.
Every ship will have an android in the future.
Yeah, like he's the progressive, but he's not. He's negative. So another thing that they brought into this is very common with Star Trek is they brought in Shakespeare. So there is Sonnet 29.
Can you say Sonnet 29?
Okay, so do you want the whole thing, or do you just want the
whole
beginning?
Thing.
Okay, so when Data is packing his stuff because he realizes, because of the loopholes in the law, that he could retire, he could resign from Starfleet so he doesn't have to be subjected or ordered to go through this. I don't even know how that guy manipulated those people to allow that to happen. But he did.
Well, it's because that captain, I keep on screwing up her name.
Captain
Lavoie, she looked up the Webster's dictionary and these rulings in the 21st century where she's like, oh, well, Data's an android and thus he's property. In which case I'm wondering, if he's property, why was he even allowed to join Starfleet in the first place?
Exactly, because he obviously went through this process already, you know what I mean?
So, I mean, this is all based on a fundamentally flawed premise anyway.
But Maddox actually just decides to invite himself into the quarters of Data because he just mentally has dehumanized or depersonified Data.
Oh, it's an it, so just walk right in.
So just walk right in, right? And then he tries to equate Data to like the ship's computer, which is the ship's computer is more like a utility or a tool. It doesn't engage in, it doesn't make relationships.
That's right.
Whereas the meta and all the components, because he's not just machine, he's also there's like software and it's almost like Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah, you didn't have the Enterprise computer exploring being human.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because Google has done stuff that they were exploring neural science, and they came up with a deep dream and a few other things, which is they don't understand how it even works. They don't understand why it works. They just know that it does. So as he's walking in, he takes this book and he just opens the cover and looks at like the cover page, which obviously there's nothing written on it, but he starts reciting his dialogue, which is Sonnet 29. It's, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day rising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love remembered, that such wealth brings. But then I scorn to change my state with kings. And that's basically Sonnet 29, but this sonnet is actually quoted, I think, in more Star Trek and sci-fi and a number of other pop culture things than any other sonnet. And there are other sonnets that are quoted by Picard, and there's like a...
There's an episode Hide and Q where he quotes Shakespeare.
Yeah, no. Was it the Ferengi one where Loaxana is
yes, I remember that one.
So he's quoting a number of mashed together sonnets as well in that. But so when Maddox, he starts allegedly reading it. Apparently he's acting. It's very obvious he's acting. But he's like, does these mean anything to you? It's like you're fascinated with Data because he's like a person, but you still won't accept that he's a person. It's almost like Maddox, like the mad scientist, have this God complex, and he wants to make a being. You know, women can do that. I'm just saying, we make beings all the time. We don't have God complexes over it.
If he doesn't view Data as a person, why does he want more Datas on the starship?
Yeah,
what's the difference between Data and the computer, where every starship already has a computer? So he doesn't need to build more Datas because, in his view, what his definition of what Data is, every starship already has one anyway.
Well, I mean, like Nooney and Soon had already built a number of androids, and several of them, quote unquote, died. And then we had Lore, who went bad. So they're obviously persons, and they're obviously individuals, and it's in the trial. This trial has a lot of really good arguments in it, even though they're very condensed, and they're also very theatrical. There's even we have really interesting camera angles and the way that the sound is edited, but it's pretty obvious that he is a person, but we also get into these really like slippery slope areas of like making us a race of slaves that are programmed. It's almost like Blade Runner, you know what I mean? Like Blade Runner kind of deals with this topic where you have because I read the novel, Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is so different than the film. And they get into sort of this, but they have more other things to contemplate in that book because it's very philosophical. But this one especially, I feel like a lot of these the trial or court type episodes really get into like political science and philosophy, ethics, and stuff like that. And that's why this is one of my favorite of them all. It's very, obviously it's dramatic as well. But there's a number of these twists and turns, and somebody's thinking ahead, and that kind of a thing.
I think the difference between Data and the androids in Blade Runner is that in Blade Runner, they're made to resemble humans completely, so that they're indistinguishable.
Yeah, they're indistinguishable.
Data's made so that he looks a little bit different, but he's still a personable being. Whereas with Blade Runner, they're attempting to deceive by creating these androids.
Well, even so, Data, as they go into the trial, they dig into even his personal, intimate details. They examine him. It's absolutely demeaning. Like, it's sad because Picard has to go through this defense in order to make the case. So he has Data has a portrait of Tasha Yar, who passed away. She was martyred on the show, and was it not Nagilum? It was it Nagilum? No, it was a different one.
It was some tar pit that
tar pit thing. Nagilum was like a space creature, right?
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
That's right.
I always confuse them. I'm so bad with names, but
Armis, I think that's the name of it, or it could be wrong.
So it murdered Tasha, but she is a security officer, so it's kind of like obvious that that's how she would go. And when Picard asked why he only had a portrait of that particular officer, he didn't want to talk about it because he clearly has, even though he doesn't have emotions how we do, he still has personality traits in his neural net. And so he can be shy about certain things, even though he doesn't feel an emotion.
Plus, he can respect other people's wishes.
He can respect
like
other
Tasha's.
people's wishes. It's very obvious that Data has a number of personality traits, like clearly like humans and like animals and so on. He's bonded with his cat, which I'm strange they didn't bring that up. But
they didn't have the cat yet in that episode.
He admitted or confessed that he had been intimate with Tasha Yar. And that was like, everyone got quiet in the room.
Yeah,
like,
they were shocked.
Whoa, because he's built to be, he was created to be like a human, like in every way except enhanced. So he has, it's in a way, he's like the child of Noonien Soon. But Noonien Soon, it wasn't enough for him to just reproduce. He also reproduced his genius and poured it into Data. So Data was like the masterpiece of, it wasn't just a masterpiece, it was, he was that actual step of becoming that fruition of a person. Lore got there, there's a few other ones that got there, but they were sort of off.
Well, Lore was evil. He basically, Dr. Soon created an android in the form of Lore who basically turned on humanity. I think Lore wanted to create an extension of humanity, not something that would rebel against it. So Data and Lore represent the two extremes of what you can create, something that continues what you want to do and something that goes against what you want to do.
And then we have, so Guinan has a cameo in this episode. She's not necessarily in every episode, but she's definitely in this episode.
No, she's recurring.
Yeah, she is recurring, but she's not always in every single one, though, right? So this is kind of one of those things with, so Whoopi Goldberg was originally, she started out as a comedian, and she would oftentimes bring up social issues in her comedy. And so a favorite film of mine in the 80s, I think most people know Sister Act, but she did I think it's 80s, it's called Jumping Jack Flash.
Yeah, I think
that's really good. That's really good. But today, she's on like The View, and she makes sort of apologist statements for wealthy people and establishment people that don't make any sense. But when you look at the body of her work, it's just like this contrast. It's like, I don't understand how the person who did this stuff in the 20th century, in the 21st century, does these other things. But
well, people change over time. Are you going to ask?
Do you have any comments about the conversation that Guinan has with Picard?
Yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, what she's talking about goes back to the Dred Scott decision in 1857, where they ruled that a black person was not a person but property, and Commander Maddox is creating a race of disposable people with these androids, and Guinan says that's a little bit harsh, and it's kind of ironic that she's the one who says that's a little bit harsh because, you know, she's played by a black actress. Picard's like, no, this is basically a race of slaves, and that ties back into how black people were slaves and were used to build basically the entire backbone of the United States of America. And these androids on these starships would probably be doing all the things that they don't want the organic officers to do. And they wouldn't have the right to resign because Commander Maddox refused Data's wish to resign. So these androids, they're stuck on this ship, whether they want to be or not, doing these tasks. And if they disobey, that's treasonous, according to them. So they'd be killed. So it's like obey us or die.
Yeah.
Stay on this ship or we'll dismantle you.
Yeah.
So basically, he's literally treating Data not as a person, but as livestock.
Yeah, and then Maddox, he wants to, it's not that he wants to subject Data to experimentation, which is already bad enough, but he wants to, quote unquote, disassemble him. So it's like dissection. He wants to disassemble him, and once you have pulled him apart, you can't ever put him back together, which means he will be dead. He will be ended.
But if something goes wrong with Data's positronic brain, so at which point he's now been permanently lobotomized.
Yes.
So it's like that character at the end of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you know, where he has the lobotomy scars.
So basically, the argument, the reason that Data refused originally, because he originally seemed intrigued, even though he was still also alarmed when he noticed the guy showed up on the bridge. And he was like, oh, so have you solved the problem of there's these certain, was it positronic type, certain components in his hardware.
Yeah, things would
that
allow
nobody
him to
can
process.
figure out how, nobody understands how they work. And they just can't, it's mind boggling. It's so complex. Even data doesn't even understand it. Which is kind of apropos because even today in neuroscience, we don't even necessarily understand everything about the human brain as well.
It's not just that, but it's also trying to reverse engineer what someone else
so
came
trying
up
to
with.
reverse engineer stuff. But because he hasn't figured it out, he just wants data to just go along with it. Obviously he won't, and he already knew that, and then he did this whole chess game set up behind the scenes. That was basically the whole premise of the story. So we're examining things like sentience. So what is sentience? And honestly, I feel like as a culture, even globally, I feel like most people have kind of expanded their view of what sentience is. Because when I was in 8th grade in the 90s, we were taught that animals were quote unquote dumb animals and that we're quote unquote personifying them or humanizing them.
But then it turns out
Right?
dolphins are intelligent.
But then now that we have YouTube and social media like lolcats and things, we can see animal behaviors that we've already seen most of our lives, but they're on video, and then you can't explain it away when you have a huge body of evidence. Like, you ever heard of the dodo? I actually applied to work for them last year. That even when you watch like TED Talks and these nerd shows, I watch a lot of nerd shows on YouTube, they actually acknowledge that a lot of there are various levels of self-awareness and sentience and so on, so that this concept of the dumb animal is gone.
I used to see articles where they'd point out that chickens had personalities, or different farm animals, and I think cats and dogs have personalities. So these animals definitely are sentient, even though we've called them not for the longest time.
Yeah, so we can exploit them or whatever.
Yeah, so you can butcher them, eat them, do whatever.
Well, we do eat them. We eat them. I eat them. So I raised chickens and I raised pigs when I was growing up, 80s and 90s. And they definitely have personalities. They definitely have feelings. They definitely have moods. And there can be rhymes and reasons, and then there can be times when animals just go berserk, and you can't explain it, because they're animals. Okay, so
We're animals
you can't
too.
rationalize with an animal, but they do have feelings, and they do have, they do care about things, and it's not all just instinct. It's complex. It's very complex. It's shades of gray. So there's that.
Yeah, but let's go into the 3 definitions that they have for sentience.
What did they define it as? So Maddox had established the self-awareness, intelligence, and then the third criteria for sentience.
Consciousness,
which clearly Data had. And
I'm guessing consciousness is the soul.
Yeah, and then everyone else was sort of debating, whether Data was a person. It was clear and obvious to everyone that he is a person. They were trying to reduce him to just machines, and then at one point they were, because he has super strength. Yeah, but there are organisms that do that. There are also organisms that can remove their
that
body
served no
parts.
purpose whatsoever. Bendis.
Yeah, because it was a weak argument. So this is where you get into things like philosophy versus sophistry, which this definitely gets into. And Riker's just trying to come up with these things. And then because of the relationships with the people here, Riker, you could tell, was experiencing extreme guilt. That he, at the end, he didn't even want to talk to Data because he was so ashamed.
Yeah, he basically turned him off, and then that was basically his bluff, like, call us. And he wanted to be called. Mm-hmm. And then that it was left to Picard to make the argument that, no, despite this person being able to be shut off, he still has consciousness. I mean, shutting him off is no different than knocking someone out. Mm-hmm. If we're knocked out, does that mean we're not sentient?
Yeah. Very good. Maddox has that kind of where he could become Mangala.
Here's the thing I don't like about Maddox. The fact that if he hasn't worked everything out, why doesn't he take the time to work everything out? Then he can ask Data to assist him, and then Data might be more willing to cooperate with him. Clearly, Maddox was trying to push through something where he hadn't fully worked out all the problems. So if he could work them out, if he were patient and not trying to do a power play, I think he would have gotten a lot more done. I just think it's stupid to try to force someone to submit to something when you haven't even fully worked out all the problems.
He hasn't worked out everything. obviously he's obsessed with Data. I mean, he's almost like an obsessed fan. Like he's obsessed with him so bad, but he clearly has some psychological issues.
It's weird to be a fan of something that you devalue.
It's like an obsessed fan. Like, so for example, like the fan who murdered John Lennon was infatuated with John Lennon.
Here's a question: why did he murder him?
Because you'll never be that person, because you want to be that person. And the only way you can outdo that person is to kill them.
Wait, it just occurred to me. If something went wrong with Data, then essentially he would have killed him. So he was like that John Lennon fan.
So, because honestly, I feel like it's kind of like a power versus powerlessness, because you feel you'll never be that person and you'll never be whatever that thing is. And yet in your mind, you're convinced that you're so superior about something, whether it's your intellect or whatever. And the fact that he can't control it or change it, so he can but what he can do is the opposite, which is destroy it, which is some kind of twisted version of power. I have power over you. So now I have you. It's almost like kind of Jeffrey Dahmer, because it's intimate. Like the serial killer, all the things that he did was very intimate with his victims. Even though it was sick and twisted, but you still have this power over them, and then you have this intimacy. Well, how much more intimate can you get with Data if you're obsessed and you can't control him, and you still think you're smarter than everything? Is you would destroy it. This is the insanity rationale.
Well, let's move beyond Measure of a Man now, because they explore Data's humanity in future episodes. Later on, they have an episode called Birthright where we experience Data's dreaming, and he begins to dream.
Oh, that is a good one. That is a really good one. Mint, was it cellular peptide cake with mint frosting?
No, this is another one where he first encounters Dr. Soong as a younger man, and he's painting, and he teaches him to explore, and then Data decides to start dreaming so that he can see more things when he's turned off. And then in an episode not too long after The Measure of a Man, Data is performing in a musical, and we hear him composing songs, and he's not just playing back songs that composers did in the past. He combined the style of two musicians to create his own version of a song, and Picard noted that at the end of the episode. Data exhibited creativity. So he had creativity, and he was able to dream. So those are definitely...
He had a subconscious mind as well.
He had a subconscious mind. He wasn't just, processing this data. Yep, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There was a lot more to it than that.
There's definitely a lot more to Data. Data was actually my number one favorite character. Actually, I liked all the characters. I loved all of them dearly, but Data was my number one favorite. So.
Okay, we're running out of time, so we're going to wrap up this episode of Streaming to the Stars. We have our own YouTube page, and you'll be able to see that information underneath. Thank you for your time, and see you next week.